This is Ash, and Ash has seen quite some up and down recently. First, the devs announced a rework that would have made him super busted strong, but then this rework actually ended up bugging him out, which caused me to publish this video here ranting about it. But then yesterday, they hotfixed these bugs, which now brings him back into the hundreds of millions of damage. So yeah, in today's Warframe guide, we're gonna take a look at the new post-rework, post-hotfix Ash, what has changed, and of course, how you can get these damage numbers for yourself. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, well, let's jump right into it. Now, let's start out the video by talking about Ash's abilities, starting out with his passive, which is relatively straightforward, but I still like it quite a bit. With Ash, the damage over time caused by slash status effects is increased by 25% and they last 50% longer. So, whenever you want to go for any type of slash damage over time approach, Ash is your best friend. Ash's first ability is called Shuriken, and this is also pretty simple. You can see that he is a relatively old frame, because what you do here is you throw out 5 shurikens in a cone in front of you that will automatically seek out and home in onto enemies, and hits with them will also increase your melee combo counter. At base, that's it, and honestly, it's not really all that impressive even though it got buffed with the update. However, we do have an augment called Seeking Shuriken, which makes this skill quite a bit more viable, because what this does is it gives your shurikens the ability to reduce enemy armor. Therefore, with the augment, I would say you can get quite some use out of this, although in today's build, we're gonna subsume over the shuriken because we don't need it. Ability number 2 is called Smokescreen, and this is also as simple as it gets. You become invisible for some time. Now, in the past, the base duration of this was relatively short and it was cringe to play, not gonna lie. But with the recent update, we got an increase of the base duration, which now makes it much more convenient to use. And also, one very nice synergy. While you are invisible, the energy cost of your 4th ability, the ultimate, about which we're gonna talk in a second here, this energy cost is halved. Now, Smokescreen also has an augment called Smoke Shadow, which makes it that you not only turn yourself invisible, but also allies in range, and you get a 150% crit chance while you are invisible. In my opinion, if you want to support your team, that's probably a viable option, and also if you want to play Ash as an invisible weapons platform frame, then you will probably get some use out of the crit chance too. But then again, if you want to play an invisible weapons platform, then you could play Side 09 or literally any other weapons platform frame with Side 09 subzoom. So I would say Ash is probably not the ideal option in this case. Therefore, I'm gonna put a question mark onto the usefulness of this augment. Ability number 3 goes by the name Teleport, and this does exactly what it says. You teleport to a nearby enemy, and then you perform a melee finisher on them with an additional damage bonus. If said finisher manages to take out the enemy, then the energy cost of the teleport will be halved, and there also is an augment which I find very nice and super convenient, which is called Teleport Rush. What this does is, when you take out an enemy with that melee finisher after the teleport, then not only will you gain a boost in parkour velocity, but this also extends the duration of your invisibility, allowing you finally for the first time to constantly keep this up and not having to recast it. If you ask me, a very convenient option. I like this, but there still is a huge problem that I have with it, and to me it still kind of seems like this can't be intentional because it would be such an anti-synergy, and that is that there is a gimmick that when you use Ash's 4th ability, the Exalted clones, about which we're going to talk next, if you use your teleport finisher ability while the clones are on the field, you actually don't teleport to the enemy yourself in a normal way, but rather you become part of the rampaging shadow clones for a couple seconds, taking out enemies with finishers as part of these clones. Why is that a problem? Because for some reason, finisher kills while being part of those clones do not increase the duration of your stealth, which effectively means that you can only increase the duration while your shadow clones are not on the field. So yeah, long story short, right now, if you want to go for a shadow clone build, then this augment is completely useless. And finally, let's talk about Bladestorm, Ash's big exalted weapon that deals the hundreds of millions of damage that you saw in the intro. This thing now, with the update, is a moddable exalted weapon. You use it by marking enemies, and once they are marked, you unleash shadow clones that will backstab and perform melee finishers on the marked enemies, and due to the fact that melee finishers are really darn strong in their damage already, the numbers that you're going to be dealing here will go very high very soon. Now, one more thing to mention is that with the update, they did add a separate combo counter for these types of exalted weapons, also going up to 12 times, and the damage that this ability deals linearly scales with this combo counter, meaning at a 12 times combo counter with Blade Storm, you're gonna deal 12 times the damage that you would do usually. Now, we're gonna take a closer look at this exalted weapon, its stats and all the shenanigans around it in just a second here. First of all, I quickly want to go over the augment here too. This is called Rising Storm, and what it does is Blade Storm attacks increase your melee combo counter even more, and you get more combo duration. If you ask me, this augment is not necessary because either you can put melee crescendo onto the exalted weapon to very quickly and very easily lock your combo counter at a constant 12x, or if you don't have it or don't want to use it, you can still go for the Naramon Focus School, which makes it that your combo counter will only go down very slowly, also effectively locking it at 12x. However, what is a definite yes would be giving the video a like to help the channel big time with the YouTube algorithm, so cheers so much for your support. And now, let's take a closer look at the exalted shadow clones. But okay, I want to take a minute here to give a closer look at Ash's exalted weapon, the shadow clones, to analyze their stats and go over all the craziness we can actually do with them. Now, first of all, the Exalted Shadows are considered a Exalted Dagger weapon and therefore can use dagger-specific mechanics and mods. Now, when the rework dropped, they were kinda sorta bugged and actually did not count as dagger weapons, but rather as external ally on the battlefield. But this has changed now, meaning they work exactly like any other Exalted melee weapon. They can now trigger melee crescendo, they can also trigger combat discipline if you take out an enemy with them, and in general, everything that you would expect. When we take a look at the stats, then at first glance, this looks really pathetic. With only a 5% crit chance, a 1.2 times crit damage multiplier, which both is abysmal, and also the status chance only comes in at a super scuffed 5%. Why is it so bad? Because the damage of those exalted clones is considered finisher damage, and as we all know, finishers deal a whole lot of damage, as you can also see in the stats here, meaning the devs turned down the crit and status stats to somehow keep this in check. But as you're also going to see in the build section in a second here, we can of course completely break this anyway. Just one thing to keep in mind, due to the fact that your base crit and status chance are so low, in my opinion, it isn't really worth it to mod into crit or status chance at all because it's not gonna get you anywhere. Rather, if you want to go for crit, then seek out flat crit buffs that increase your crit chance regardless of the base value. I'm talking about stuff like Arcane Avenger, which will always give you a flat 45% plus. That would increase the crit chance here from 5 to 50%. Then we have the Adarza Kavat doing the same thing, just with plus 60%. And the king of flat crit chance for melee weapons, of course, would be Kalervo's Wrathful Advance, which with enough ability strength will give you guaranteed red crits regardless of how low your base crit chance is, just to give you a couple of ideas. As for the crit damage, also here the base of 1.2 times is relatively low. I wouldn't go so far to say don't even mod for it because you can still do something with it. But also here, flat crit damage increases like Tenacious Bond or Arcane Crepuscular are very much recommended if you want to go for a crit approach on the Exalted Shadow clones. But alright, now that we know the ins and outs of the Exalted Shadow clones, let's take a look at how to actually mod this thing. First off, as I said, in the Arcane slot you can either use Melee Crescendo to increase your combo counter and keep it at a constant 12x, this is the most convenient option for sure, but if you want to squeeze out the utmost damage possible, then Melee Exposure will be your go-to because of the added corrosive damage that it puts onto the weapon. As for the mods themselves, since this Exalted Shadow Clones weapon is considered a dagger, and it does melee finishers, we can and definitely should use Covert Lethality, increasing your finisher damage. Up next, since the setup that I'm about to show you today is gonna be a crit setup, we naturally go for as much crit damage as possible with Organ Shatter and Galvanized Steel. And yes, even though Galvanized Steel might cosplay as a crit chance mod, in reality, it is and always will be primarily a crit damage one. Up next, we want to have as much base damage as possible, which is why we go for Condition Overload, massively increasing our damage, Primed Fever Strike, which adds a whole chunk of elemental damage onto the weapon. The reason we use Fever Strike here is just because it has a primed version and therefore gives the most elemental damage possible here. Then I also went for a faction damage mod to dip my toes into that too. And in order for our clones to not take forever to clear the room, we go with Berserker Fury, because now you can actually mod the attack speed of your Exalted clones, which makes them way more convenient to play. Now, in the final mod slot, and this might be a little bit confusing here, I decided to go for Primed Pressure Point, even though we already have a lot of base damage with Condition Overload on the weapon. But when I tested this, I tried to swap in and out many different options here. For example, Gladiator Might for more crit damage, Finishing Touch for even more finisher damage, different elements to combine with our Toxin. But in each and every individual case, Prime Pressure Point actually ended up being the stronger option, so I just ended up sticking with it, which would bring us this full build right here. But yeah, that would be how to build the Exalted weapon. However, as you might have been wondering, we invested a whole lot into crit damage, but there is zero crit chance investment on this build. Why is that? Well, in order to answer that, let's take a look at how to build Ash himself now, starting out with the helmet option, where I chose to go for Kalervo's Wrathful Advance, which already tells us where the crit chance comes from because this thing is a red crit machine. Now, I personally prefer the red crit Wrathful Advance playstyle, however it is actually not the only helmet option that you could go here. If you were to rather go for yellow crits with something like Arcane Avenger maybe, then subsuming Banshee's Silence and the Savage Silence Augment will also be able to yield you damage in the hundreds of millions, which is actually more than enough for all the content in the game. Up next, let's take a look at the Archon shards, where I went for 4 purple ones, all into more melee crit damage, just to ramp up those damage numbers as high as physically possible. Is this necessary? Absolutely not. Is this complete and utter overkill? Absolutely. But are 500 million damage really darn cool anyway? Well, I'll let you decide on this one. But no, seriously. This setup here is just pure overkill for the funnies. In reality, it would make more sense to invest red Archon shards into him for more duration so you can keep your invisibility on for longer, and even if you go for Wrathful Advance, more duration helps here too. However, if you, like me, are an Ash fan and you want to go for the purple shard approach, just make sure to use 1 Tauforged blue shard to increase your maximum energy, because even Ash Prime, even with Prime Flow, only gets up to 427 maximum energy, and you need at least 500 maximum energy to double the effects of the purple Archon shards, so that Tauforged blue with its plus 75 maximum energy, barely getting us over the 500 mark, is absolutely necessary if you wanted to play this setup right here. So much for the Archon shards and the helmet ability. Let's now take a look at the Ash build itself, where the first thing we're investing into here is a lot of ability strength with Blind Rage, Transient Fortitude, Growing Power in the Aura, Power Drift in the Exiles mod, Mold Augmented, Humble Intensify, and in the second arcane slot, I went for Arcane Crepuscular, giving us plus 30% additional ability strength while we're invisible, which is going to be all the time with Ash. But the main reason Arcane Crepuscular is in here is actually not the ability strength, but the second effect, which adds a flat 3x on our crit damage multiplier, making the damage output of our Exalted clones even crazier. For our energy economy, we go with Equilibrium and Primed Flow. And just like I mentioned with the Archon shards, you really need Prime Flow here to get over the 500 maximum energy. And then we also want to have a little bit of duration, so our invisibility as well as a Wrathful Advance stay on for longer. That's why we go for Prime Continuity, and then I went for a half Narrow-Minded, because while it gives us a lot of duration on the one hand, it also massively cuts down on our ability range, which is fine to a certain extent because Ash has a relatively high base range on all his abilities. However, if you were to fully max out your Narrow-Minded, then the negative impact on your range would be quite noticeable, and that's not what you want. In my opinion, the sweet spot here is to keep narrow-minded at level 5 or 6. And then finally, but this is really debatable here, I use the Teleport Rush Augment, which allows us to use our third skill, the teleportation, to increase the duration of our invisibility. As it stands right now, I would say this mod doesn't really make sense and you'd rather put anything else of your choice in here, because as I mentioned in the skill section, when you use your teleport while your shadow clones are out, kills for some reason still do not increase the duration of your invisibility. If that ever gets fixed in the future, then I would highly recommend, for convenience sake, to go with Teleport Rush here. However, until that is not the case, Teleport Rush actually doesn't make sense. This right here then would be the full build. As you also see throughout the video, hundreds of millions of damage, super duper easy, no problem. And when it comes to weapon and companion options, definitely use something that can go with Tenacious Bond to further increase your melee crit damage, but also make sure that your companion runs Synth Deconstruct, otherwise you're not going to generate enough energy through your equilibrium. The Panzerwolf Befeiler is probably the best option here, and for your weapons, you're free to choose whatever you like. One thing to keep in mind though would be Ash's passive that buffs /damage, so going for /DOT on your weapon might be a good option. But if you rather deal your damage with the shadow clones, then make sure to bring some sort of status primer like the Epitaph, like the Kuvanu Core, like the Cedar with the Alt Fire. All this will help massively to stack up your condition overload on the Exalted Shadows, so they deal as much damage as they physically can. And if you like big melee red crits, then don't miss my updated Baruch guide right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostanix Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycan Shepherd, Anakanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.